There is no punctual moment of disaster. The world doesn't end with a bang. It winks out, unravels, gradually falls apart. To make art is to bear the weight of reality, to encapsulate it with as few degrees of separation as possible. This has always been the role of the artist. Where other schools of thought like philosophy and science are practiced within their own paradigms and canons, art has always floated freely, allowing itself to be reborn again and again with little regard for its past or current conditions. Capitalism poses as a potentially terminal illness for this mode of being, with its emphasis on value production driving a wedge between art and reality. To consider your art's monetary worth as part of its creation is to untether it from your raw, lived experience. This new condition is part of what author Mark Fisher calls capitalist realism, the idea that there is no alternative to capitalism and that in turn nothing can exist outside of it. Not only is one now forced to consider their art's tangible value, there is in fact no other consideration that matters. Effectively putting a bullet in the back of the Dadaist sentiment, art for art's sake. But what are the full implications of capitalist realism on art and the artist? Mark Fisher, a prolific political theorist, philosopher, and blogger, published Capitalist Realism through Zero Books in 2009. The short 81-page book has become something of an enigma on all levels of academia. Its conciseness, short length, and alarming claims are comparable to that of the Communist Manifesto, a brutal little tome that's rebuilding the foundation of contemporary left-wing thought and critical theory. Its impact lies in its simplicity. Anybody with the smallest understanding of how the Western world works could pick it up and read it in one sitting. If you've never read Capitalist Realism, I suggest reading it as soon as possible. It's essential reading. I'll link a free PDF in the description of the video. The book's opening chapter discusses the meaning of capitalist realism. Fisher discusses it in context of postmodernity, but says the two are not analogous. For simplicity's sake, I don't want to begin to define postmodernism. Rather, I'm going to define it in contrast to modernism. Modernism is defined by a belief in unilateral progress, absolute truth. Scientific progress, capital, and personal fulfillment could all be attained by working hard in the continuum of Protestant morals and well-established modes of being. An image of a white-bread American working a manufacturing job and coming home to his nuclear family behind a white picket fence may come to mind. And a contemporary example would be the lifestyles pushed by figures like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro. Following modernism is postmodernism, which is basically the absence of modernism, a disintegration and fracturing of modernism's truth claims and meta-narratives. And according to some, that's the dominant condition we exist in now. The reason Fisher claims the two are not analogous is because postmodernism implies a relationship to modernism as if the two are in competition. Capitalist realism, in turn, absorbs both and employs them when needed. In that sense, cultural rebellion can become mainstream, and the mainstream can become rebellious. A really good parallel to that is how an interest in finance and economics has flipped from practical mainstream advice into a sort of guerrilla movement, with things like crypto and consumer stock exchanges. People now talk about bag chasing and money moves as if they're part of this underground scene, when they're really just describing something that, until the last 10 years, was yawned at by anyone under 40. It's impossible to tell what Mark would have to say about TikTok and Instagram Reels, those spaces being the main platform where one can find this mainstream turned rebellious content. You're seeing mainstream ideas being codified and repackaged as esoteric. Recycling and rearranging old ideas is a consequence of art's value being the primary concern for its creation, and perhaps the dominant condition of art in capitalist realism. Aside from ideological opponents of capitalism being absorbed to create our state of capitalist realism, societal critiques of capitalism are also co-opted. Fisher argues that bugs in a capitalist society have been subverted as features of nature, rather than problems with capital. Bureaucratic power structures, rampant mental health problems, and environmental destruction have all been pinned as features of natural law, to the point where we now believe they just make sense. The rise of depression in increasingly younger age groups is the fault of one's genetics and genealogy. It couldn't possibly have anything to do with overstimulation in the 21st century, or the ever blurrier line between work and home life. And furthermore, we believe the competitiveness of capitalism is the only way out of these problems. It's not as if we are being told to work more by our higher-ups. Rather, we're choosing to work more as if it's a moral obligation. Similar to how we've radicalized something as mundane as finance, productivity has also become a guerrilla movement. Many young professionals now gamify their entire lives into perfect regimens of structures and supplements. And not only do we willingly work ourselves into burnout, but we hold ourselves accountable by plastering our entire lives on social media. Again, as if vulnerability and accountability were moral obligations. This echoes the statement of Byung-Chul Han's Psychopolitics, a book my friend Sisyphus55 just made a video about, so watch that if you'd like to explore that topic further. To bring this back around to art, it's interesting because the artist has always operated like this, with or without capitalism. The overworked and brutally honest artist trying to capture their raw bleeding heart in their medium of choice is an archetype so cliche it might as well be primordial. I find myself reflecting on that idea a lot. I consider the fact that all I've done for this past week is work my day job, lift weights, and work on this video. Behavior that could easily be cast as overworked and antisocial. And I wonder how much of this project I've undertaken is part of some search for creative truth, and how much of it is just the desire to succeed. I want this video to do well, regardless of its content. I want my YouTube channel to grow so I can make more money and save more money. I plan on selling prints of the painting I've created for the B-roll footage. I've even chosen to discuss capitalist realism because I know it's topical. It will hit the algorithm better than Friedrich Jameson or post-structuralism or some other topic in the same vein. In this sense, as most artists have, I've almost been economically and culturally gaslit. Can we ever trust ourselves to create authentically? Or have the deepest levels of our psyche been penetrated by the drive for value production? This is the question this video really aims to answer. Another factor in our self-imposed suffering is something that Fisher calls market Stalinism, a term for how the bureaucratization of markets actually mirrors Stalin's Russia rather than free market capitalism. In the 21st century, we base our work performances on ideals and symbols of production, rather than year-over-year improvement. Anyone who's worked in an office or taken a university course understands that satisfactory is not good enough. Similar to how yield quotas in Stalin's Russia were often unrealistic and didn't reflect what was actually possible. Institutional structures now are predicated on a perception of growth for PR purposes. If you've traded stocks, then you know the importance of quarterly and yearly reports. Does a good quarterly report reflect the universal and quantifiable growth of the company? It doesn't matter. Do high exam scores actually reflect the superior quality of the education? Doesn't matter. Mental health and well-being of the corporate structure is crumbling, while still looking good in quarterly reports. The problem Mark has presented here is actually the solution. This perception is cognitive dissonance, and cognitive dissonance and ignorance are necessary for our system to continue to run smoothly. To explain this, I'm going to use the fine art market as an example. Art is most valuable in our system as an asset class, being bought or sold like a stock or a commodity. Us laymen gawk at seemingly ugly art selling for exuberant prices, perhaps believing that we're missing something. Somebody else better understands what's going on than we do. And the thing is, on a fundamental level, nobody knows. All that matters is the perception. Of course, the easy answer is that it's valuable because we've applied value to it. But why have we applied value to it? What makes this painting worth money and this painting not worth money? See, I actually lied there. I flipped the prices. Unless you knew the prices of those two specific pieces of art, you would not have known I flipped the prices. Because we literally can't tell or point to why either of those paintings are worth the money they're worth. When we begin that line of questioning of asking why something is valuable, things begin to fall apart. And our disbelief in the system, our cognitive dissonance, our acceptance that we don't know and that no one really knows, so we're not going to question it, is what keeps things valuable. To question it would force it to change. To not question it allows it to continue how it is. Through all these ideas I've just brought up, economic growth, structural growth, the value in art, the value in anything, the common thread is perception. In this sense, as author Jean Baudrillard would say, we live in a simulation. We live in a simulation of our own perceived value of things. What capitalist realism does is recognize the existence of the simulation, where modernism doesn't, and where postmodernism believes in an absence of truth as the truth. Capitalist realism recognizes that it's all a simulation. And through that realization, things can just move around freely like assets in a video game. Things can become valuable or not valuable for any reason. Reality is only the story we tell ourselves and nothing more. Where old ideas would resist this, capitalist realism embraces it. And it has to. The idea of capital itself is just mythology. It's just a game. To ask why a piece of art is valuable is to ask why money is valuable. With all of this in mind, it's tempting to critique Marx's ideas for the fact that he's just discussing the absurdity of life through an economic lens. The absurdity of money and the absurdity of capitalism is the absurdity of life itself. Once we created language and retreated inside our own heads and began theorizing and began creating stories, we disconnected with reality. That's when perception began to matter more than reality. I would like to critique Marx on this, but that's a philosophical cop-out. You can dismantle any argument by saying that everything is meaningless. The implication of capitalist realism on art is the fact that the artist will never find answers in the external world. To create art for the purpose of value production is to create art for a reason that doesn't exist. The external world is flimsy. It's so thin. It's all perception. And to hark back to the opening quote of this video, the external world is unraveling. It's gradually falling apart. The antidote to that is to ignore it. Ignoring it not through cognitive dissonance. Mark mentions near the end of the book that real anti-capitalism can't be a reaction to capitalism because in that sense, it's already been co-opted in. It has to be a true alternative. As I mentioned, art has always floated freely from these topics. It need not be wrapped up in economics. Art cannot be a reaction to the external world. The artist should make art as instinct, in the same way an animal hunts. A situation from which nothing can happen, suddenly, anything is possible again.